Guys, Boxing Gossip here for you on a lazy Saturday, should I say, afternoon. I'm going to do a heavyweight roundup video, just covering 2 or 3 heavyweight news stories that have broken the last week or so, because I've had a number of requests just to discuss a few elements of these topics, and I just didn't have the time to sit down and go into separate thoughts on each particular one. So we're going to cover a few off in this particular video. We're going to start with the news that Eddie Hearn is apparently pushing for a fight between Luis Ortiz and Jarrell Miller. Potentially a very, very intriguing fight for my money. Now, last week when we were doing the podcast, we had a lot of requests for people to discuss Luis Ortiz and his potential next moves. He's clearly a fighter who has captured the imagination of the public, and it looks like he could well be due to fight Jarrell Miller. As you guys will know, Luis Ortiz at some point is due to face the Joshua Klitschko winner for the WBA Super Championship, but we understand that the IBF will get their mandatory in first, so Kubrat Pulev will be the mandatory to fight the winner of Joshua versus Klitschko before it comes round to Luis Ortiz. And with Luis Ortiz's advancing age, it is sensible they keep him active and keep him busy. So it looks like Jarrell Miller could be the man he goes up against. Now we'll have to see. Clearly in heavyweight boxing, especially when you're dealing with undefeated fighters like Jarrell Miller and Luis Ortiz, these fights are never easy to make. So we'll have to see if and when it does happen. But for my money, it's actually an intriguing fight. Jarrell Miller is a guy with momentum, a young guy who, you know, is destined for good places, in my opinion. He's been making a lot of noise. He looked very good last time out against Fred Cassie. And Luis Ortiz is another guy who has looked exceptional on the way up, but seems to have struggled in his last 2 fights. Now, the Jarrell Miller-Luis Ortiz fight is an intriguing one. Stylistically, I actually think Jarrell Miller is a fighter who would play more into the hands of Luis Ortiz than his last 2 opponents. Malik Scott was very negative, fought on the back foot, and used a lot of movement and evasive tactics to avoid Luis Ortiz. Similarly, Dave Allen, in his own way, and Dave Allen's a very different fighter to Malik Scott, but Dave Allen employed tactics that had some similarities to Malik Scott, in the sense that he was very defensively minded, very on his back foot, you know, very aware of maintaining that distance. And Luis Ortiz wasn't seen at his best against either of those opponents. For me, Ortiz is a devastating force of nature when someone puts it on him, when someone is prepared to have a fight with him and have it out with him. And you know, when he's been up and able to fight at, you know, medium range to close range against opponents, we've seen Luis Ortiz at his devastating best. And against Jarrell Miller, you'd have to assume he's a fighter who's going to bring the pace and he's going to stand there and trade it off with Luis Ortiz. So stylistically, this fight has the potential to be a great clash. Jarrell Miller is a legit huge man, a monstrous man. He would have a real substantial size advantage over Luis Ortiz. And you know, I know Jarrell Miller hasn't fought at the same levels as Luis Ortiz, but he's shown that he has good punch resistance to date in his career. We know that he comes from a kickboxing and MMA background, and apparently showed extreme durability in that circuit as well. So this could be a fascinating fight if it were to be made. You've got a young, high output, big, come forward guy in Jarrell Miller, who maybe lacks the skills of Luis Ortiz, but is he catching Luis Ortiz at the right time? Is he catching Luis Ortiz who's not getting any younger? Is he going to be able to enforce a relentless come-forward style that can wear down the stamina of the older man? You know, a potentially very, very interesting fight. Or will we see Luis Ortiz back to his best? You know, we've seen him against more negative opponents, more back-foot opponents. Will we see Luis Ortiz returning to devastating form? You know, against Jarrell Miller. I'd make Ortiz a substantial favourite. I think Jarrell Miller would be more in line with the type of opponent that Luis Ortiz would be seen at his best effect against. And I think Luis Ortiz would have a substantial advantage in terms of technique and sort of boxing pedigree and class, if you like. But a very, very interesting fight between 2 very, very interesting characters. I'm slightly sceptical as to whether it will get made. If I was managing Jarrell Miller, it's not a fight that I would take for Jarrell. You know, he's a young guy with a big future ahead of him, and I'm sure if he waits it out and takes the right fights, he can get to a world title shot without taking a risk of this nature. So I'm not 100% sure the fight gets made. It's not a mega fight at this stage. It's not like a pay-per-view fight or anything like that. So whether the motivation is going to be there for Team Miller to make the fight, I question. But if it were to be made, it's a fight that I'd support completely, and it's a fight that I'd very much look forward to. Sticking in the heavyweight division, a fight that has been made. Adrian Granat versus Alexander Dimitrenko. Now, Granat is an opponent is a heavyweight who I've covered on this channel before. He's someone who's rated quite highly, specifically in that Scandinavian heavyweight circuit. He's someone I've had on the channel to do interviews with, and you know, hopefully we'll get him back on again in the future. The fight against Alexander Dimitrenko is, if I'm completely frank, a fight that I personally wouldn't have chose from Granat. And the reason for that is Dimitrenko looked absolutely woeful of late against Joseph Parker. He really looked, at this stage of his career, like he was just turning up as an opponent. Now, he's a named fighter. He's a fighter whose name has some credibility, specifically in European boxing circuits. But you've just got to wonder if Granat actually goes out and destroys Dimitrenko. You know, say Granat goes out and hammers him in 2 or 3 rounds. You've got to wonder how much credit Granat will actually get for that. Because Dimitrenko's showing and performance against Joseph Parker was so bad, it would be hard to rank Granat really highly off the back of that. Having said that, on his day, Dimitrenko can be a tricky fighter. So, from my perspective, I'm not 100% sure this is the matchup that I would have chosen for Granat. Now, I understand his team have been trying to make waves with the likes of Bogdan Dinu, Robert Helenius, and I understand those fights maybe haven't been as forthcoming and as was initially hoped for. But, you know, nevertheless, Dimitrenko's a named opponent, and a win over Dimitrenko from Adrian Granat, and I'd expect him to win, would surely bring him into the top 30 of the heavyweight division. You know, Granat was one of them guys who narrowly missed out when I was doing my top 30 in January of this year. But I do think that a win over Dimitrenko will probably just about nudge him into the bottom end of those lists. So, yeah, potentially one to watch, and it'll be interesting to see the manner with which Dimitrenko is disposed of by Adrian Granat, and hopefully this can be the start of big things for Granat moving into 2017. One other fight that I wanted to talk about was a rumoured match up between Ugonoh, who I know a lot of my Kiwi subscribers are fans of because he's associations with Joseph Parker, but a rumoured fight between Ugonoh and former Anthony Joshua victim Dominic Brezeale. Now, Brezeale was initially scheduled to fight Arthur Spilka, and there seems to be some doubt now as to whether that fight will go ahead. The reason being that the TV execs are sceptical as to whether they want to put on a heavyweight fight where both guys are coming off a loss. Spilka's obviously coming off a knockout loss to Wilder. Brezeale's obviously coming off a knockout loss to Joshua. And apparently the TV broadcast company involved have questioned really whether they want to put these two guys in on a TV bill when they're both coming off a loss. So potentially it sounds like Ugonoh is being lined up to face Dominic Brezeale, which will be an interesting fight and will be a big step up for Ugonoh if you compare to the opponents that he's been in with previously. Now, I'd feel quite sorry for Arthur Spilka off the back of this. Spilka's a guy who lost heavily to, by bad knockout to Bryant Jennings and to Deontay Wilder. But he's a guy who on his day is a real talent. He's got the potential to be a top 15 heavyweight, as far as I'm concerned. And I know he's got wins over Thomas Ademic and 1 or 2 other names on his resume, but he gave Deontay Wilder some real work in their fight. And Spilka's a guy who, despite having lost by knockout when he stepped up to the top 10 level, he's a guy who I'd definitely like to see again. So if this were to be made, and if Spilka was to be left out in the cold, I personally would feel sorry for Spilka. I think he's worth another look, and I hope a big fight is made involving Spilka soon. Potentially a fight not where Spilka's the opponent like he was against Wilder, but a 50-50 matchup like the Brezeale fight where he can, be in a meaningful fight and potentially get the W. Now, as for Dominic Brezeale, I presume the TV execs are having another look at him because he's a marketable guy. He's a very big man. He's an American heavyweight. He's an Olympian. I presume that's potentially why they're looking at giving him another chance after the loss to Anthony Joshua. I personally would make Ugonoh a substantial favourite over Dominic Brezeale if the fight were to be made. Brezeale, I had him mid-20s in my rankings for the heavyweight division, but this is a guy who, for me, doesn't have the upside to go any higher than that. He's so slow, so plodding, so unathletic. He doesn't put punches together with any snap. He's got things in his favour. He's a very big guy, very long guy. He showed good durability and good heart against Anthony Joshua, and some surprising reflexes in how evasive he was at times. But realistically, in terms of putting together offence to beat a top 20 opponent, I just don't see that in Dominic Brezeale. All of his work is too laboured, too slow, too cumbersome. And I think a guy like Ugonoh, who's a far more athletic, snappy, fast heavyweight, I think would have too much for Dominic Brezeale. And I think Ugonoh would either win on a wide points decision or could potentially even cause a late stoppage, because I do think Ugonoh could put the punches together to create a vast gap between himself and Brezeale. That would be a notable win for Ugonoh. He's another one, like Adrian Granat, who didn't make my top 30, but you know, a win over Brezeale will put him right into the 20s as far as I'm concerned. So, yeah, two interesting heavyweight prospects who look like they're going on the way up. Let me know your thoughts on all of these heavyweight stories, people. Ugonoh versus Brezeale, will it happen? Ortiz versus Miller, will it happen? What do you make of Dimitrenko as a opponent for Granat? Let me know your thoughts. Do leave them in the comments section below. If you've enjoyed the video, please hit the thumbs up button. And if you're new to the channel, please take the time to subscribe. Many thanks indeed for watching.